Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks the 20th day of job action in the Metro Vancouver transit system. This job action has already affected the 1.4 million rides per day, close to 1 million people using the system to get to work, to get to school, to get to their appointments. It's critically important to the people of Metro Vancouver. It's already been a source of frustration to the people who live in Metro Vancouver, and we have seen absolutely no action whatsoever from the government. The union announced that it now plans to conduct a full-scale system shutdown next Wednesday through Friday, and this will bring Metro Vancouver basically to a standstill as the 7,000 people who work at Vancouver General Hospital can't get to work, for instance. So this is critical. And sadly, we have seen no sign of any activity whatsoever from the government benches. We have no sign of any activity from the Premier, and the Minister of Labour is so totally invisible on this file that no one even knows his name. So the obvious question that arises, if we're trying to address the critically important infrastructure in Metro Vancouver that keeps the system running, that keeps our society functional, when is this Minister of Labour going to actually do something rather than sit in his office and smirk?
Minister of Labour.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Yes, obviously it is a very difficult news for all those who use transit on a daily basis in Lower Mainland, and no one wants disruption of services that we all depend on. It hurt families, hurt workers. That's why we are urging both sides to get back to the bargaining table. Mr. Speaker, I must make this clear. They are in no position to give any lessons to anybody when it comes to collective bargaining. Mr. Speaker, only thing they know about the collective bargaining is how to tear up collective agreements that were negotiated through collective bargaining. We're not doing that. But, Mr. Speaker, it's a matter between the employer.
Members. Members. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's a matter between the Coast Mountain Bus Company and the union. They have negotiated successfully numerous collective agreements without any help from anybody. So that's why I'm asking them to get back to the table, and that's where the solutions and the fair deal can be found. And, Mr. Speaker, I expect that they will be back at the bargaining table and negotiate a collective agreement that they can both live with.
Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labour talks about taking lessons in labour relations. There aren't going to be any lessons at UBC, Kwantlen, Douglas College, Emily Carr. They'll all be shut down Wednesday through Thursday. Calls for patience. Well, there are different kind of patients who aren't going to have any visitors. They're not going to have any nurses. There are going to be no LPNs to take care of them. There'll be no lab technicians to take their blood and measure it. What does this minister think is going to happen when the transit system shuts down entirely next Wednesday through Friday, and he sits in his office here in Victoria and takes his car to Surrey and says, I guess that's tough, it's because of the collective bargaining process. What are people supposed to do in a city of 2.5 million people while this minister sits on his duff and does no work at all?
Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said, we are looking for a speedy conclusion to the labour disruptions in Metro Vancouver with a free and fair negotiated agreement. Mr. Speaker, the opposition would like you to believe that somehow they pretend to care about the ridership, the people who ride the transit, Mr. Speaker. But they didn't care about the transit riders. When the mayors came to them for help, they said, suck it up. They didn't care about the riders, Mr. Speaker, when the expansion to south of the Fraser was being discussed.
Members.
And they and the Premier at that time said, well, we'll have a referendum. As a result, Mr. Speaker, 10 years have gone by. We have nothing to show for south of the Fraser, thanks to them. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, they didn't care about the riders when they eliminated.
Members, the Minister of Labour has the floor. Thank you.
More interested in heckling than an answer, I see.
So, Mr. Speaker, all they care about is how to take a political advantage over labor disputes. We're not doing that, Mr. Speaker. They didn't care about the riders, Mr. Speaker, when they eliminated disability pass, Mr. Speaker. We all remember that. Mr. Speaker,
Members.
Mr. Speaker, they know if they ever look in the mirror, if they ever talk to anybody who have done any collective bargaining, they know that the best collective agreement comes at the bargaining table. Bargaining table Mr. Speaker, the negotiations take place not in the media, not in this chamber, at the bargaining table. We are urging both of them to get back to the bargaining table and get a collective agreement.
Member Richmond Queensborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Metro Vancouver transit system looks completely different from 18 years ago when the last strike took place under the previous NDP government. Today, there are 58 additional bus routes, 520 additional buses, 1,400 additional bus operators, and annual ridership has increased by 206 million boardings a year. It's an essential service, Mr. Speaker. Current contract talks could not be more stalled, and it's time for both sides to work towards a resolution. The strike has now dragged on for 3 weeks, Mr. Speaker. Why has the Minister of Labour failed to appoint a mediator?
Member, I didn't hear the question. Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, this is an essential service. The member from North Van Lansdowne has been missing in action on this issue. The Minister of Labour has entered some sort of NDP witness protection program. He has not been heard from for the people of Vancouver. So I ask once again, this strike has dragged on for 3 weeks, Mr. Speaker. Why has the Minister of Labour not appointed a mediator?
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, they are not in position to give lessons to anybody but collective bargaining. None whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, they have shown no respect to the working people in this province. Especially
Members, I'm concerned again that we're eating into time which could be spent asking questions. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, when the leader of the opposition was going through his leadership campaign, he said that the BC Liberals was sitting 30,000 feet up, out of touch with the reality. Mr. Speaker, with their actions and what they've done in the last 2 years, they haven't come down an inch, Mr. Speaker. And if they keep it up, Mr. Speaker, they'll be sitting on that side of the House for a long, long time. And you know what? The workers of this province are really happy they're in a position to ask questions, not to answer questions.
Members. Member for Richmond, Queensborough on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the transit system exists today. It's more essential to people's lives than ever before. People use transit to go to work, go to school. They have no other choice when it comes to transportation options, Mr. Speaker. Both sides not negotiating holds the public hostage. Over the last 3 weeks, the Premier and his Labour Minister have shown zero leadership. So I'm going to ask the same question again, and I hope he can answer that question on behalf of the people of British Columbia and residents of Vancouver. Why has the Labour Minister not appointed a mediator?
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the member has ever involved in collective bargaining. I don't think so. But if he has, Mr. Speaker, he would know.
Members,
If he has, Mr. Speaker,
members, we shall hear the...
Mr. Speaker, if he had, then he wouldn't be asking a stupid question like this.
Members, please allow the minister to respond. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, their history on labor relations, when you talk about 14 years of fight that they picked with the teachers, Mr. Speaker, 14 years. And Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker, took only 20 minutes to say that what they did was illegal. Mr. Speaker, the International Labour Organization cited that government more than once that they were not complying with the international labor laws, Mr. Speaker. That's what they did. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the best collective agreement is negotiated at the bargaining table.
Thank you.
And that's what I'm urging both sides to get back to the bargaining table and hammer out a fair collective agreement.
Thank you. House Leader, third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The white bark pine tree was listed as endangered under the Federal Species at Risk Act in 2012. In 2017, the federal government released a proposed recovery strategy for the white bark pine in Canada. 42% of the global population of this species lives in BC. But since the species was listed as endangered, more than 19,000 cubic meters of the trees have been logged. In 2013, Lake Louise Ski Resort in Alberta logged a patch of trees that included just a few dozen white bark pine. The company was fined $2.1 million for what the judge called reckless behavior. But in BC, no fines, no restrictions, no guidelines for companies to avoid logging an endangered species, and 19,000 cubic meters logged. My questions for you, Honourable Speaker, to the Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. How, in 2019, is his government allowing the continued logging of the white bark pine despite its endangered status?
Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources and Rural Development.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member, and I believe she has two aspects to that question, one around public lands and one around private lands. And first of all, on public lands, our government is committed to conserving BC's diverse biology, and that includes the white bark pine. It's a species that grows in upper subalpine elevations. It grows above the tree line. It has limited commercial value, and provincial practices specify this species is not to be logged. We are working with the federal government for the implementation of a recovery plan, including rust-resistant screening program, because the major threat to white bark pine is blister rust. So we're planting seedlings that are resistant to that. We're working with the Data Conservation Centre on pine mapping technology as well. However, her question also brought up concerns, I believe, around logging on private managed forest lands, and that act has not been reviewed since it was first established in 2003. We heard concerns about activities on private managed forest lands and that program, and so we initiated a review. That review was launched. It's now complete. We had 27 in-person sessions, received over 1,200 submissions, and we'll be releasing a What We Heard report, Honourable Speaker, was released earlier this month. We'll be engaging with local governments and First Nations to get more feedback on that report and implementing and our final report and recommendations from that in the new year. And that has to do, again, with white bark pine.
House Leader, third party on a supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for a thorough answer to things I didn't quite ask. I did note the report. I did review it recently, and one of the things that stood out was the predominance amongst stakeholders, citizens, interest groups, First Nations, local governments about the lack of conservation and protection of ecosystems on private managed forest lands. British Columbia invests less in the protection of wildlife per person or per hectare than any other state or province in the Pacific Northwest. The discrepancy is startling, with Washington State, for example, spending 23 times more per square kilometre to protect wildlife. Earlier this year, the BC Wildlife Federation released a report noting the following, quote, "While the human population, resource extraction and threats to habitat and wildlife have increased significantly, the funding and capacity to support natural resource management have declined. This is the opposite of other jurisdictions and the opposite of what British Columbians expect." I note the very powerful statement given by the member for Fraser-Nicola about the decline of steelhead as an example of what we are seeing right now with, in respect to endangered species around this province. My questions for you, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Without provincial legislation dedicated to protecting species at risk, how does he intend to mitigate the loss of wildlife in our province, particularly at a time when climate change has already begun to alter entire ecosystems?
Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Strategy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. One of the reasons that species at risk legislation is included in my mandate letter, and the reason that I have assured the member in the past and the public that we are working on it and that we intend to bring it in this mandate is what we inherited after 16 years of failed promises from the former government. The failure by the former government to take any meaningful action has meant that it's become harder to protect BC's ecosystems and species, and we've created instability for Indigenous communities and industry. We have, for the last 2 years, been consulting broadly with communities, with Indigenous nations, over 120 Indigenous nations in 22 regional sessions, to work together with communities, industry, stakeholders, Indigenous people, and environmental scientists to find a path forward to protect BC's species at risk in a way that works for everyone. We take that seriously. We're continuing to work on that. But we have and will continue to take action in the meantime as we try to get the legislation right. We did, for instance, sign an agreement with Canada and the Syilx Okanagan Nation to establish a national park in the South Okanagan-Similkameen. This is a region, Honourable Speaker, that is home to 11% of Canada's species at risk, and I look forward to working with the federal government, with the nations and with British Columbians to bring these kinds of protections to this irreplaceable region and others throughout British Columbia. Thank you.
Member for Abbotsford West.
Mr. So, Mr. Speaker, I've sat in this chamber with former social credit labour ministers. I have sat here and listened and debated with a number of NDP labour ministers. I have obviously worked with labour ministers that were BC Liberals. I was one of them. I have never, ever heard a labour minister of any political stripe dismiss the suggestion of the appointment of a mediator as being stupid. Never. Ever. Would the minister stand in the chamber and explain to the British Columbians, who are going to be at their wits' end because of a labour dispute, how it is he feels it's appropriate to characterize the appointment of a mediator who might help bring settlement to that dispute as being stupid?
Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, and I said this before, that no one likes to see disruptions of services that we all depend on, because it hurt families, it hurt workers. And there are so many people in Lower Mainland who depend on transit to go to work or comply with their responsibilities. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we're asking both sides to get back to the table, because that's where the best negotiated agreement will come from. Mr. Speaker, but we will stand. We will stand for a fair and free collective bargaining process. And that's what I'm encouraging both parties to use and utilize. They're both mature when it comes to collective bargaining. Both have a history of having a collective bargaining and concluding collective agreements numerous times without any outside help, Mr. Speaker. And that's where the best collective agreement will come from, at the bargaining table, not in this chamber, not in the media. So that's why I think the opposition should join with us and encourage both sides to get back to the bargaining table, because that's where the negotiated agreement will come from.
Member for Abbotsford West on a supplemental.
The minister operates under the ambit of legislation that provides him with a set of tools. They are a limited set of tools by which he can provide assistance and guidance and encourage the resolution of disputes that are going to impact and have already impacted hundreds of thousands of people. He has just dismissed as stupid use of one of the basic tools that governments and labour ministers have utilized for decades. He has dismissed it as a stupid idea. So he sits here, Mr. Speaker, and he says to the opposition and others, join with us. When a suggestion is made to him, when a legitimate question is put to him on behalf of the British Columbians that are going to be inconvenienced, will he appoint a mediator? He says to the questioner, you're being stupid. Mr. Speaker, why should British Columbians have any confidence in a Labour minister who has such a poor grip on the tools that are available to him to try and resolve a labour dispute in British Columbia? And will he apologize for using that kind of language?
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, like I said, we need no lessons from that side of the House when it comes to collective bargaining. No suggestions. And I will remind the House, it was that side when they were on this side of the House. They were actually engaged in provoking strikes, Mr. Speaker. They were engaged in provoking strikes by tearing up collective agreement, throwing 10,000 of workers on the street, Mr. Speaker, tearing a collective agreement that was legally negotiated for decades by these workers, Mr. Speaker. So they are not in a very good position to suggest anything when it comes to collective bargaining. We are, Mr. Speaker, serious, and we are going to respect the free and fair collective bargaining process, and we are allowing both parties to get back to the table, and we encourage them so that they can have a collective agreement and so that the people who are dependent on the transit are not inconvenienced.
Members. Members. Member Prince George Vilmont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we learned about a confidential briefing that was provided to the government earlier this year regarding the proposed union benefits agreements. Here's what the briefing note said about the agreements, and I quote, "high risk and incompatible with fixed price and fixed schedule contracts." Can the minister stand up today and tell British Columbians specifically what she and the government were told about the possible consequences of moving forward with a proposal to look at union benefit agreements?
Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have the utmost confidence in our community benefits agreements. That's why we're proceeding with them on projects in the transportation sector, and we'll be looking at them for other infrastructure projects, Mr. Speaker, because we believe that when we build BC, when we build the infrastructure of BC, we need to invest in the people of BC, Mr. Speaker. This is something that the opposition in 16 years of government never realised that you have to invest in people. They have left us with a huge skills shortage, a huge skills gap that we are addressing through community benefits agreements, Mr. Speaker, because we're going to be making sure that people get trained and ensure that they get to be able to complete their Red Seal apprentices. So we're very comfortable with moving ahead with community benefits agreements. We've been very clear with people about it, and we will continue to proceed with our community benefits agreements for the best outcome for everyone in British Columbia, Mr. Speaker.
Member Prince George Vilmont on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think it's up to British Columbians to decide about whether or not the union benefits agreement are actually a good thing or not. And what's critical to that is actually this minister standing up and answering a straight-up, simple question. We asked the minister, what advice did this minister, this government, this premier receive about potential consequences? Let me help her out, because here's what the briefing note said. According to the briefing note, the government was warned that if the premier insisted on a backroom deal, it would result in fewer bidders and higher costs. I think British Columbians deserve to know that this government got advice that the cost of those projects would go up, there would be higher risks related to scheduling and completion dates. Can the minister, for once, just once, stand up in this legislature and tell British Columbians, did she receive that advice, and did she, the Premier and the government, decide to move on anyway, knowing that the ultimate payer of the extra costs would be the taxpayers of British Columbia?
Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I find it very difficult to take that this opposition as government tries to preach to us as government on the cost overruns and the potential risks of infrastructure projects, Mr. Speaker, when their history is one of overruns. Mr. Speaker, may I just remind the House, when they were government, that we saw overruns of up to 82%, Mr. Speaker. 82%. We are very confident that the community benefits agreements are going to be serving the people of British Columbia very well. We have seen the outcome. We've seen the opposition when they were government, as well as having massive cost overruns on infrastructure projects, use the same model, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they use the same model on, if I might go through them, Brilliant Dam, Revelstoke Unit 5,
Members.
Juanita Dam expansion, Mr. Speaker, 2015 Mica Unit 15, Mica Unit 6, number 6, and the John Hart Generating Station. Mr. Speaker, this is a system that has been used for many, many years. We are very comfortable with that system, Mr. Speaker, and we will be continuing using it.
Member North Vancouver Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, from that answer, it appears that perhaps the minister has not even seen the briefing note. So let me remind the minister what this briefing note said about her community benefits agreements that are really union benefits. That the community benefit agreements have risks, staying on time and on budget, and risk cost overruns because all of these union rules are more expensive. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is that the Premier's Friends and Insiders deal means workers are denied opportunities, BC contractors lose work, taxpayers pay more, and the public gets less. Now, apparently this minister is denying that this briefing note exists. And I quote again, high risk, fewer bidders, and higher costs. Will this minister tell us whether or not she's seen this briefing note? And if she has, would she please table it for the House?
Government House Leader. Members. Members. Members, the Government House Leader has the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I've listened with interest to the questions from the opposition. And what's been really interesting is they go, have you heard, have you heard? Well, Honourable Speaker, we heard loud and clear from families and parents across this province who want more opportunities for their kids than they ever saw when outside the province. We heard from parents who wanted their daughters to be able to have skilled apprenticeship training, Honourable Speaker, and that's what community benefits are about. We heard from First Nations who want to see their kids have the opportunity that other families have, that they can get skilled trade, Honourable Speaker. And that's what's happening under community benefits agreements. They want to know that when public money is being spent, it benefits British Columbians first, Honourable Speaker, not some vested interests. It provides opportunities for communities, large and small, families right across this province. That's how the dams in this province under WAC Bennett were built, Honourable Speaker, and that's what we're doing to build opportunity for the future of young people in the province of BC.